Hello and welcome, everyone. We will just wait a few seconds to give everyone the chance to jump in, and then we will start in a few seconds. Hello and welcome, everyone. We will just wait a few seconds to give everyone the chance to jump in, and then we will start in a few seconds. All right. I think people had the chance to get in. I'm Jacob Fleming. Welcome, everyone joining us both on Zoom and on YouTube, or watching this later on YouTube. I'm a program manager at Atlantik-Brücke, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Atlantik-Brücke from our new offices. We just had a move from our former offices in Berlin-Mitte to Berlin-Kreuzberg. And I'm pleasure to welcome you here from Berlin-Kreuzberg to the second edition of our new virtual event series, Better Be Prepared. And I know there's a lot to prepare for these days, in particular for us as transatlanticists, because there's a lot of things happening on the world stage right now. And I guess it is an understatement to say that transatlantic alignment on the pressing issues could be better. Today, we want to focus on a particular issue, which is the situation in the Middle East and the war between Israel and the Hamas terrorist organization that has been going on since the attack of October 7th. The situation is obviously very dynamic. We are now in a phase in which the first phase of a ceasefire agreement agreed upon in January has ended. The proposal by the United States and Israel to extend the first phase of the ceasefire was rejected by Hamas, and in response, Israel has ended all humanitarian aid to Gaza to cease that. And in the meantime, the negotiations are being held, brokered by Qatar and Egypt, about the release of the still remaining 24 hostages and a permanent end of the war. We want to make sense of all of this in this hour we have today, and we have invited three outstanding experts to discuss this with us. Joining us from Israel at 5 p.m. local time is Dr. Avner Golov. He is the Vice President for Research and Alliances of Mind Israel. Mind Israel is a nonprofit, action-oriented consulting team advising governmental, nonprofit, and corporate clients on complex national security issues with an emphasis on policy design, planning, and execution. Most recently, Avner, with his colleague and co-author Ron Friedman, published a German language piece in Internationale Politik Quarterly in the second issue of this year about the forward-oriented strategies for the Middle East, with a special emphasis on Germany's role in that. Then to cover the German perspective on the conflict, Dr. Bente Scheller is joining us, also from Berlin. She is the head of the Middle East and North Africa division of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and her analysis of current events in the Middle East are on high demand, with both newspapers and German television on the situation in Israel and Palestine, but most currently also in Syria, where a lot is going on right now. And we will certainly also touch upon that a bit today. And finally, from Washington, D.C., joining us is Brad Bowman. He is a senior director at the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Focusing on U.S. defense strategy and policy, he has served as a national security advisor to Republican members of the Senate Armed Services and the Foreign Relations Committees, as well as an active duty U.S. Army officer, Black Hawk pilot, and assistant professor at West Point. His analysis has been published also by various U.S. news outlets. Before we dive right in, just let me remind those of you watching us on Zoom right now that you can submit questions through the Q&A box you find at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to pick them up in the last 15 or 20 minutes or so of this discussions. So this conversation is titled Disruption in the Middle East. So let me start with you, Brad, not because you're a disruptor, but you're the American on this panel, and you can maybe try to help us make sense of the disruptor-in-chief, President Trump, and his plans for the Middle East. The Europeans have been irritated by a lot of things coming from the new US administration lately. Among them, President Trump's words, visions, and actions regarding the Middle East. He has repeatedly demanded the immediate release of all remaining hostages that Hamas keeps in Gaza, and said that the Palestinians and Hamas would have hell to pay if they wouldn't comply. He then introduced this Gaza peace and reconstruction plan, saying also that the US would take control of Gaza. He put out this AI-generated social media video showing him laying at the pool together with Prime Minister Netanyahu at the Trump Gaza Hotel. And now, in this moment, and a few days ago, his administration, Steve Witkoff, but also the Hostages Affairs Special Envoy Adam Boehler, they are engaging in direct negotiations with Hamas, and thereby breaking with a long-standing US policy of not talking to terrorist organizations like Hamas. So, Brad, what is the game plan here, and how realistic, in your assessment, is it that this approach Trump pursues will bring any kind of peace to Gaza and the hostages home?
Oh, well, thank you for hosting this conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and hearing their insights. I find myself a lot these days trying to explain what's happening in Washington to friends across the pond, as we say. I don't pretend to have a monopoly on wisdom, but let me share a few quick thoughts based on your great question. You kind of rattle off a list of things there. Let me just take them in order. Release the hostages. I think after the horrific October 7th terror attack, then President Biden, his first week was one of his best weeks of his presidency, where he spoke with clarity about the horrors of that day. And he stood with Israel rhetorically, and then proceeded to initiate the second most impressive U.S. security assistance campaign in recent decades, second only to what we've done with Ukraine. But over time, what we found with the Biden administration was increasing public criticism of Israel, and then also we saw some slow rolling and withholding of weapons for Israel, both of which I thought were a mistake. Because when your best friend in the Middle East, that's how I view Israel from an American perspective, experiences its worst day, you don't join the bullies and start kicking your friend when they're down. If you have criticisms or suggestions, you share those privately with your friend. But if you do it publicly, then you're empowering the adversaries of Israel and the United States and encouraging them to be not less aggressive, less likely to make concessions. So I thought that was a mistake. So what do we have with Trump now? We're seeing basically the Trump administration saying yes to basically every weapons request and munitions request that Israel has. More than $12 billion have been approved by the State Department, and they're using lawful and assertive approaches to getting those through the congressional process or waiving that process consistent with U.S. law. And then, as your question goes, you have President Trump, being a disruptor. I was going to use that phrase before you did. I agree. I think that's the right word. If you read H.R. McMaster's book, he's chair of our center. I worked with him in Afghanistan. President Trump is a disruptor. He takes pride in being a disruptor. But the problem is, as HR says, sometimes he disrupts his own agenda based on, who he just received advice from most recently, and so forth. And so I like here. I'll say a few things I like and don't like, and then I'll conclude. I like the clear messaging to Hamas from the president that, release the hostages now or else. I like that if this administration is willing to back it up. If you're not willing to back it up, you're like a parent who threatens to spank the child or discipline the child and then never does it. The child quickly learns that the words don't matter and you can do whatever the heck you want. So, Republicans tend to be very critical of Barack Obama and his red lines. Well, if we're going to issue threats, you better be ready to back them up, or American deterrence and the credibility of our words and warnings will decline. And so that goes to the hostages and the hell to pay comment. On the negotiating directly with Hamas, I got to admit, I don't like it. And unfortunately, this is not the first time that we've seen the Trump administration do something like this. In the first Trump term, some of the viewers may remember that the Trump administration negotiated directly with the Taliban in Afghanistan, or with the Taliban, and then pushed the Afghan government aside and ended up codifying what was a very badly formulated deal that put the Biden administration in a bad position that they proceeded to make worse with their catastrophic withdrawal. So this is, I don't like this. It seems to me the main thing the U.S. government needs to be saying to Hamas right now is disarm and release the hostages, or else, and then back it up. I don't know what else needs to be said. And I would not recommend that the U.S. speak directly to Hamas without the full support of Israel. I mean, that just seems like that's not an appropriate move. So I don't like that. And then in terms of the video that was released, I thought it was unseemly and distasteful and ill-advised. It was not well received in the Arab world. You know, one can spend a little bit too much time worrying about Arab popular perceptions, but at the same time, you don't want to disregard it and be disrespectful, right? Because if we want to build on the Abraham Accords and we want to have a big normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which would be good for regional security, good for American and European interests, and bad for the Islamic Republic of Iran, then we don't need to be poking our finger in the eyes of Arabs. And any sort of plan that involves the wholesale displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, I think one is unrealistic, and is not going to happen, and might be unlawful. So I think those are some important considerations. So in this moment, I'll conclude with this. I think I like that the Trump administration is standing both in word and deed with Israel. I worry about some of the implementation here. I worry about direct talks with Hamas. I think more than ever, we need to be working with our allies and partners to build unified approaches that first and foremost understand that you're not going to get that whatever progress we're going to make in Gaza is going to be measured in years, not months. And that whatever hotels or fancy buildings we want to build in Gaza, it's going to be of limited value if you don't deal with Hamas as a terrorist organization. We have to make sure that it can never again do what it did on October 7th, that it's not part of the governing coalition and does not have the means of murder that we know they'll use again if they have the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. And maybe let me turn this to you, Bente, to hear the European perspective. I mean, many of the concerns that Brett just shared are also shared by European leaders. They were rather dismissive of any words and actions coming from the White House in the recent weeks regarding the Middle East. So let me ask you this, maybe. What is the European alternative game plan right now, and how relevant in your assessment an actor is the EU in general in this conflict at the moment?
Thanks for having me. And thank you very much, Bradley, already for sharing so many important points. So there are many things that I'd also underline from a European perspective. First of all, of course, that there is movement, that there is something happening. I think in the past month of the Biden administration, we saw that a lot of the issues were on the table already. The plan for the ceasefire was there, but not the backing and the implementation therefore lacked until President Trump came. And I think this has been seen as a very positive thing, that something moves, that there is progress, that the ceasefire started. And I think also some of the other issues where we were in between things between the US administrations, there is hope that things advance. However, I think from the European perspective, there are so many things that we don't know about what the administration is going to do. There is a random element in Trump's policy in the Middle East, and some very strong words and some very strong action. But also in the first Trump administration, we saw that one day it is this, the next day it might be something different, whereas we think whether we've seen the US acting as a very strategic actor in the past with a long-term vision, and I think this is what we're missing now. And that is relevant. You asked me, Jacob, for the European contribution. In the past, it was very clear. The US is the leading power when it comes to the Middle East conflict. I think particularly Germany, but altogether Europe has also always been at the side of Israel, always been interested in supporting peace in the Middle East, but in a secondary position. And that has been something where opinions were different between different actors in Europe, how strong the US position should be and where it was heading. But at the moment, we feel that Europe is very much involved in its own affairs. It is not in the best shape. Also being threatened by Russia to this extent doesn't make it easier. And then without a very clear American lead that Europe could support, it is difficult. And particularly when it comes to very relevant questions in this situation after October 7th, the terrible massacre of Hamas and the hostage taking. In the past, Germany used to play a constructive role in mediation efforts, bringing back hostages that had been kidnapped in the past, for example, by Hezbollah. These efforts, I think, were useful support focused on the hostages as one of the very, very important, very tragic issues in this conflict. This part, I think we have not been able to fill it. I think it was also maybe not that much on demand. But here, I wish that Europe would have played a more intense role, because I believe the record of hostage release in this part of the conflict shows this comes mainly through negotiations and not so much by threats. And therefore, I think we would have had some room to better handle the situation and better offer services, and maybe we didn't. But I think in any case, the interest here in bringing peace and stability is very strong, because we feel as we're very close to the conflicts geographically, and therefore I think our interest might be even more direct in terms of the impact that we'll feel from it in Europe, and that will remain for the coming years. And here, what I think Europe's main desire would be to see what is the strategic vision, both of the Israeli government as well as the US, what would be the next steps and where should it lead. In the end, we see bits and pieces, and some I feel are very contradictory. Also announcements of Trump, for example, to want a solution and to really have a very strong wording, but then with what is he going to back it up? Weapons deliveries are one thing, but for example, funding, which before was an issue, I don't see that the US plans to be involved in that much any longer. And therefore, I think that's the main thing. And the video that you just mentioned, I think it's not only Arab states and populations that were irritated by that. I think given this, the severity of what is at stake, it also felt, to many Europeans, it felt a bit out of place.
Yeah, it certainly did. So now the Europeans are not sitting on the table and the negotiations brokered by mainly Qatar and Egypt. So Avner, you've written a piece in International Politik, as I mentioned earlier, and you specifically wrote about Germany's role and said it would be well positioned to be a peace broker because of its good ties to both Israelis and Palestinians. How would you say, can Germany or can Europe assume this role? And how is the Israeli perspective on that role Europe can play?
Thank you, Jacob, for having me. Best regards to everyone from Tel Aviv. I would like to start by thanking Brad for his warm words. We really appreciate, our friends in these dire times. Second, I want to emphasize two things. One is, I don't know who is in the audience. I don't know how many times you visited in Israel, how many Israelis do you know. It's a different Israel since October 7th. So if you think you know about something about Israel, put it aside, come to Israel and see this is something new. Israelis, for the best or for the worst, they will not be willing to concede on their security in the near future. They realize that buying time, that trying to improve economy, working with the enemies is something that over time will lead to another October 7th. So you are going to see, I'm not justifying it, but we are going to see Israel surrounding itself with a big buffer zone. You see it in Gaza, you see it in Lebanon, now in Syria, you will see it in Jordan, maybe with the West Bank. This buffer zone is needed for Israelis to think about the future. And here, this is my second point. I think out of this war, we learn many things. One is Israel's best partner is the US, but we knew it before October 7th. The second place belongs to Germany, and Germany earned its place in the heart of the Israelis. And I think most of my people understand today that this is a strategic relationship. We have many tensions and I think mistrust that we need to work on with many of our European partners. And I think it's mutual. They feel the same. But I think Germany now earn a different place, and this is why I think Germany can lead a much bigger role here in everything that belongs, related to Israel's security, because Israel sees German as a friend, as someone who cares and understands the misgivings of the Israelis. I'm not sure peace it's the right word. Let's start by not having war and build a political horizon. But here I think it may not be a good diplomatic talking point. But I think everybody should shift from their old paradigms, including the two-state solution. Everybody that talks, and I read the Arab Initiative that talked about the two-state solution. Guys, most of the Palestinians don't believe in a two-state solution. Most of the Israelis don't believe in a two-state solution. The US, who was historically the only one who can help the two people to move toward the two-state solution, this is no longer the paradigm. So we need a new paradigm. Doesn't say that we need to concede on our vision of peace, prosperity, and stability in the Middle East and the Israel's border, but it must be something more feasible that related to what we are seeing in reality. And here we need new partners, we need new ideas, we need friends that understand our misgivings and concerns, but also can come with creative ideas. And here I think Germany can take a significant role that so far it avoided from taking, including reforms in the Palestinian Authority, including finding a replacement for UNRWA with a bunch of other organizations to make sure that the Palestinian refugee issue, we are not perpetuating it. And maybe thinking about how to maintain security in a dynamic reality which can create a political horizon, a better future for the children of Israel and the children in the Palestinian territories. We need partners, we need friends, and I think Germany, it's the best location, historically speaking.
So one of the preconditions for new ideas and creative ideas and anything that is supposed to bring peace in the future between Israel and the Palestinians is to remove Hamas from power, right? And maybe, Brad, let me ask you, how can you, we have a war going on now for almost 1.5 years. Hamas is definitely weakened, but they haven't given up on power yet. How do you think can this be achieved? Can it be achieved militarily, or do you think the negotiations that are currently taking place will see as a result Hamas being removed from power? Do you think this is still a realistic aim? It's one of the most crucial preconditions for any sort of lasting peace.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for the comments of the other two panelists, which I thought were very insightful. In the after the horror of October 7th, just from my vantage point over here in the United States, there were a lot of Israelis that were just, were so severely traumatized. It seems to me it was some combination for them of from an American perspective, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, right? But instead of the people that did 9/11 against us coming from thousands of miles away, they came from a few miles away, and they came into many bedrooms. So just the shock of that day. And so what Dr. Golov is saying about how Israel is not the same, and international observers need to understand that. And what he was saying, my words, not his, how any possibility of a two-state solution is more remote now after October 7th, right? So anyone who wanted a two-state solution, I'd say the possibility for that is far more remote now because of what Hamas did on October 7th. So I would just say that. But there was a lot of talk about, hey, Israel's going to defeat Hamas quickly. I would have loved that. I would have loved for Israel to defeat Hamas quickly. But as a former U.S. Army officer who spent some time in Afghanistan, I know these things are easier said than done. And one of the I wish Israel all speed and success, but these things are difficult when you're fighting terrorist organizations. And there's a term that Americans use called clear, hold, build, right? We learned this the hard way in our times in Iraq and Afghanistan. Step number one is you got to clear the terrorists, right, from a particular area. And let's be clear, Gaza is a particularly challenging area given how urban and dense it is, confronting an adversary that is systematically using their own people as human shields. So clearing is hard enough. And then you got to hold it. And that's very troop intensive, requires a lot of troops. Otherwise, as Israel unfortunately saw, they'd go in, clear area and leave. And then here comes Hamas right back into the same areas. And then you got to build. So what we're seeing is a lot of discussion jumping to building before we've even effectively cleared and held, Israel has cleared and held Gaza. So I am that's why I said earlier, I think this is going to be measured and sadly in years, not months. And so that's why I, for my part, am focusing on getting Israel the weapons it needs, and to defend itself, because we know that Hamas will try to do as many October 7ths as it can in the future if it has the means to do it. And sadly, it's my understanding from our research that you have Hamas recruiting thousands of young soldiers, many of them child soldiers. So what Dr. Golov said about many but not all Palestinians supporting Hamas is true. And you see them recruiting more soldiers. So, are we going to trust Egypt to come in and do this? Well, let's remember that many of Hamas's weapons came across the border between Gaza and Egypt-controlled Sinai. Either they came under the border or over the border, including some of the weapons and munitions used on October 7th. So are we going to trust the government that enabled Hamas to arm itself, to come in and police Gaza and then go after Hamas? I don't think so. In Qatar, just very quickly, Qatar, I mean, here in the United States, we see our college campuses exploding. We saw that with all the encampments. And we've seen a strong correlation between universities that receive Qatari funding and Qatari funded professors and some of the worst illegal activity on our campuses, including at Columbia University. So Qatar, let's be clear, is not a good faith negotiating partner, full stop, period. Even though in America we call them a major non-ally, they are not acting like an ally in many cases. And I worry that Egypt, the country that facilitated the army of Hamas, is not going to be able to clear and hold to enable the building. So the response to what I'm saying, well, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? I don't want American troops in Gaza. As a former U.S. Army soldier, I'm not sure Israel would want that, even though they've said some things following Trump's announcement. And so I think what Israel's going to have to do is build those above ground, underground barriers, maintain sufficient ground forces with sufficient readiness in and around, maintain some sort of at least remote sensory presence in the Philadelphia corridor, and go in from time to time to take care of threats there, because they've learned, with deference to Dr. Golov, I want to hear what his response is. I think one of the main lessons of October 7th, both in Lebanon and in Syria and Gaza, is that Israel cannot afford to outsource its security to anyone else. UNIFIL's not going to do it. No one's going to do it. They're going to have to do it themselves. And that's going to cost a lot of money. That's why I think Israel's going to have to spend a whole lot more on defense, because they got, and with this, Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, Iraq's a growing problem, Houthis, West Bank. And the more time we spend on all those things and not talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran, we're playing right into the puppet master strategy.
Do you want to respond to that, Bente or Avner? Go ahead.
Thank you. So, but I absolutely agree with you. I will say, if I'm looking on Gaza, a success story must be built in 3 phases. One is the demolishment of Hamas militarily first, and bringing all the hostages back. This is the most urgent thing. It's children, daughters, brothers and sisters. They should be back home yesterday, immediately. And then, making sure that Hamas is no longer a military threat to Israel. I think to some extent we are there. And destroy its political establishment. We are not there yet. But if we are to do it all over again, and start by doing this, as Brett said, we are going to fail. So we need second phase and a third phase. The second phase must be a new leadership in Gaza. I truly wish we had a good a Palestinian candidate who can do it, but I don't see it. And I think even those who signed the Arab plan are saying that this PA is not good enough. We need a much more effective and powerful PA, so they call it RPA, Reform PA, Revised PA. Let's agree that there is no Palestinian entity who can do it now. So we need a different leadership. I would prefer an Arab mandate, an Arab coalition, that to steer this kind of progress with a Palestinian committee on the ground, unaffiliated to both Hamas and PA to start with. But let's build something Palestinian that can hold in the long term. In the meanwhile, the Arabs should put their skin in the game, steering and monitoring this process. And I think this is where Israel will feel much more comfortable. I absolutely agree with Brad. Israel is not going to export its security to anyone else. So during this process, Israel should get the legitimacy and freedom of action to operate against any military buildup of Hamas. Because let's be clear, this is Hamas' plan. They don't care about the civilian part of in Gaza. They just want to have some kind of legitimate Palestinian government to allow them to build the military power again. We call it, adapting the Hezbollah model back to Gaza. If we are to succeed in the two phases, we can create a third one, which will be long. As Brett said, years-wise. De-radicalization of the Palestinian society, starting with Gaza, to make sure that, yes, we have a pragmatic leadership that can, prevent war from coming, but we need to build something much stronger, and then you need the two peoples to know how to live together. I think it's too far-fetched today to ask the two peoples, after what they underwent, to agree to a solution that can bring them and put them together next to each other. Too risky for my people, and I don't even want to ask it from the Palestinian people after what they were suffering. So let's be, realistic, and maybe we can start pave the pathway to this solution by using a transitional phase, which is performance-based. And here again, I think the German role is crucial in monitoring, in helping the de-radicalization process. And again, finding a substitute for UNRWA, which for me, it's part of the problem. It can never be part of the solution.
So let me come back to phase two, new leadership in Gaza, and ask you, Bente, an Arab mandate, as Avner proposed. Do you think this is a good idea, a viable idea? And what kind of role or what kind of position will the Europeans have on this?
Well, depending on how it would look like, basically, this is something that is in the Egyptian plan that was now presented. They speak of a technocratic leadership or a technocratic entity to lead into a future in which Hamas does not have a role. I think it is not specified who should be part of that, and I think they see a role for the PA. I'm not sure what we would want and whether we can have what we want, because I think, well, I've also spent a number of years in Afghanistan. We can't really impose leaderships. We can't just start from scratch, because there is no scratch. There is always something, and we need to live with those who are there and those who are available. And therefore, I think if we just don't have the choice, we can have a wish list, but I'm not sure how realistic it is to have neither Hamas nor the PA an Arab force, because in the end, what we expect from them to deliver would be stability. It would be Israel's security. It would be legitimacy, however, that they would need to implement in Gaza and among Palestinians what is needed for that. And therefore, well, legitimacy, you can't just create it from nowhere. They have to earn it, they have to own it. And so I'm not sure how any solution would look like. I think this the vision that is in the Gaza peace plan, the Gaza rebuilding reconstruction plan that Egypt presented, is not the worst. for Europe to support it, I think, as I said, there is a lot of interest in supporting it. Abner, I think one of the issues that both you and me have been saying, a role for Germany as interlocutor, as mediator, I think we were better positioned before to do that once because we had the trust, and I think it is really not obvious how much trust we lost all across the Arab world and particularly among Palestinians. I don't know whether today we would still be able to fill that role. That would also need to be seen. The readiness, however, would be definitely there. And I think looking at the necessary steps, we've been talking a lot about military aspects, and I think the military destruction of Hamas is pretty complete. I think 23 of the 24 brigades are gone. I think there a lot has been achieved already, but after that, what comes? I mean, this is also a question that we had in Afghanistan. We basically also had it several times before in Lebanon. The destruction of entities like the Taliban in a military sense may not be that challenging, but they might come back. There might be other forces. Pushing out the PLO from Lebanon in the 80s was not so much of a problem, but after that, there was Hezbollah. So I think all these efforts are valid, and I think they serve a purpose. However, to rebuild something that guarantees stability, that needs a more political approach, the question how governance should be executed. And here, I'm not sure how much I've already heard about that. It's difficult to imagine, given that the war is not over and the hostages are not at home. But I think this is what we need if we look at the longer term.
Maybe just a quick follow-up, because you mentioned that Germany had lost trust in the Arab world. Now looking specifically at Germany for a moment, our Chancellor Prospect, Friedrich Merz, he, I think, arguably has been notably and consistently more supportive of Israel's war efforts, even more supportive than the previous government of Olaf Scholz. Do you expect there any meaningful change in Germany's approach to the conflict and Germany's role there?
Well, I think the government has always been consistent in its support for Israel, and therefore, as you say, from the Chancellor to be, I hear a readiness to go stronger into military support for Israel. But I think this is only one part of what is needed. Efforts should lead to a situation in which Israel does not have to fear for its security any longer. I think in this we all agree, and it's absolutely necessary. However, Palestinian self-determination is an issue. It needs to be there. And I think, speaking of de-radicalization, you'll not achieve it by military means only. On the contrary, the harder populations are hit, the more likely, I think, radicalization as such will take place. So what are the barriers that we will support against that? How are we going to make sure that Palestinians have a reason to trust there is a future? And speaking of that, I mean, UNRWA is part of the solution. They were never meant to be a part of the solution. They are there as long as there is no solution. They don't have a political role. They don't have a mandate to negotiate, but they have a mandate to fulfill certain roles until a solution and self-determination is achieved. Therefore, I think this would not be the main institution to address to find a solution or to circumvent or to replace. On the contrary, if we replaced it, I think how would the mandate look like? We can't task an entity to find a solution for the conflict in the current situation. We have others to do that.
Where do you quickly want to respond? And then I would like to turn to Iran to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, what I'm arguing for, I think it would be a mistake for Israel to conduct a permanent, large-scale military presence in Gaza. I think that would be a mistake for Israel. I think it would be a mistake to put U.S. combat forces in Gaza. So what does that leave? And I don't trust the Palestinian Authority. That would be Arabs in some form, but I don't see the political will right now to do that. So I come back to my clear hold build. I'm all for building. I want every innocent person to have the food, water, healthcare, safety that they need. We're all created in God's image. I want that. But you can't get that unless you have security first. Dr. Scheller's point about there is no military, my paraphrase, no military solution for DRAC. That's right. But sometimes our terrorist adversaries find military solutions. Boy, the Taliban sure found a military solution in Afghanistan, and Hamas sure tried to find a military solution on October 7th. So while we undertake the decades or centuries-long effort to de-radicalize those who have sick Islamist ideologies, in the meantime, they're going to try to find military solutions. So it's not an either or. Dr. Scheller wasn't suggesting that, but I'm just saying, while we undertake the work of trying to convince Palestinians that the primary obstacle to peace is not Israel or the United States, but is Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and groups like that who harbor a sick Islamist ideology, until a decisive majority of Palestinians realize that Hamas is their adversary, not Israel, this is not going to improve, and any efforts of de-radicalization, I respectfully submit, will fail. So in the meantime, and that meantime may be years, decades, or centuries, let's say make sure that the world's only majority Jewish state has the means of self-defense.
So let's take a look at the broader picture. I mean, we've already touched upon Iran a little bit. I mean, both you, Brett, and Avner, you've mentioned it, that also from the Israeli security perspective, the biggest threat to its existence, to its very existence, is posed by Iran and its nuclear program. And maybe it's a little bit simplified, but in the past there were two different approaches, also creating a divide in the transatlantic partnership to Iran: the Obama administrations and the Europeans' approach that created the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, that tried to prevent Iran from going nuclear with the deal, and also lifting sanctions on the regime while they could still develop their ballistic missile system. And on the other hand, there were the Trump administration that then ended the JCPOA, and also Israel, that has always opposed the JCPOA and rather preferred a maximum pressure on Iran. Now we are certainly in a different environment. The JCPOA has been terminated, and the missile program, the ballistic missile program of Iran, has been developed over the past 10 years, and also to a point when there's a very short nuclear breakout time left. So Avner, maybe let me ask you this. Do you think now there's a chance for a new Iran approach that Israel, the United States, but also Europe can agree on?
It's a good question. You know, everybody is agreeing now, which is a good start, about maximizing the pressure as much as we can. Now, the debate is, what's the purpose? One purpose can be, you know, let's pressure them so they will agree to a deal. Second is, let's pressure them so they will make a mistake, and then we can act militarily against them, taking it back, because no deal, you know, on the enrichment leg, Iran is there. They have the facilities, they have the know-how. So if you want to take them back seriously, it's only using military force. But military force, if you don't complement it with diplomatic effort, then you can find yourself with a nuclear Iran. So the last option, which is a silver bullet, you know, this is the winning all the coins, is maintaining pressure, which is hard enough for this regime to control all the internal issues that they have. And right now they are preoccupied with so many internal and external challenges, but in a way that will not lead to escalatory steps by the Iranian regime. So not being too tough, maintaining sanctions, putting pressure, but not too much in order to avoid escalation. And by doing so, you may accelerate a natural process which will lead to the regime collapse. You know, my dream, every night I can go and dream about changing in the Iranian regime. I think it will solve so many problems in one thing. I truly think that, by the way, that from a regional point of view, Israel has one best strategic partner in the region, and this is Iran. If you look historically, if you look about the societies, in the future, these two countries will have a strategic relationship, an alliance. Maybe my children will enjoy, seeing that. But so far, this regime is an obstacle to this. So I don't think we can base our strategy on our wishful thinking that this regime will collapse, even though it's not natural to the Iranian people. So I will put my priorities this way. I want a good deal with Iran that will prevent Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold, sense enrichment. We are in the 90, in Europe and in Israel, football, this is, European football, not American football. This is the most popular sport. So we are in the 19th minute in terms of enrichment, but we can block all the weaponization related activities, including everything belong to arming the warheads of the missiles, with nuclear warheads. So we need to block and make sure the Iranians are not doing anything related to weaponization. And I have concerns that beneath the ground, they are doing it now. To some extent, there is no, command of dashing to a bomb, but things, my sense is that people are playing with prohibited materials and they should stop. Second, having no sunset. I did my PhD in the Fletcher School in the negotiation class. If my professor would have told me, create this mechanism that will relieve the sanction and ensure that when you will want to extend the deal, you will be left with no leverage, no levers whatsoever, I would have told him, Professor, this is a bad deal for negotiation. So please, let's amend this idea, and the next deal with Iran should not have any sunset in order to prolong it as much as we can, and not only kick the can down the road. And the last thing is more supervision over the activities, including military activities. What we have now, we had in the JCPOA, it's not enough, because we want to block the capability and motivation to cross the nuclear threshold. If we get to this deal, this is the best outcome. Nobody wants to use force. But if it's about another JCPOA which buys time, kick the can down the road, and leave Israel with a much more powerful Iran than what we are having now after the war, because they are in a very weak point, but with a much more developed nuclear program, I think that we can coordinate a military effort with our partners that will take the Iranian nuclear program back, and then our partners can come to the Iranians, guys, you have two options. You can move forward with the nuclear program, and now you're going to mess with us. Or B, let's agree on the good agreement that you refused to until now. And maybe this way, the Iranians will agree to a good deal that will make sure that Iran will never have nuclear bomb.
So you're proposing a better deal than the JCPOA. Now, President Trump has sent a letter to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei a few days ago, calling for negotiations on the nuclear program. But this was immediately dismissed, as I understand it, by the Ayatollah. Brett, what do you think? Is there a realistic chance for a new deal? And if so, would Avner's conditions that you just described would be accounted for in that deal? And if not, is there a realistic military option?
Thanks. Very quick. A lot of questions there. I'll try to be quick. I want to hear from Dr. Scheller as well. I'll just put my cards on the table. Speaking of cards, in my view, the Islamic Republic of Iran is a terrorist organization masquerading as a nation state. When we act like they're a nation state in good standing, we deceive ourselves, and we're more likely to end up with bad policies because we're not seeing clearly. So I think good policy starts with seeing clearly. And this is the world's leading export of terrorism, and that's that's supportable by fact, and we should start there. I think the first Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement was a disaster. I worked in the U.S. Senate for 9 years. I was there during all of this. We warned at the time that it was going to provide a patient pathway to a nuclear weapon. The sunset clauses, the stamp of approval and enrichment, the lowering the bar on the delivery vehicles, it was a disaster. So I'm worried that we're going into this and neglecting the advice of President Trump in his book, The Art of the Deal, where he talked about going into negotiations with the strongest hand possible. Mr. President, if you want to get a good deal, you got to strengthen your hand. And the way the Supreme Leader is blowing off your letter, Mr. President, suggests that we don't have enough strong a hand. So I think we need to double down, triple down on the max pressure campaign. There's some signs that the Trump administration is starting to do that. And we need to triple down on a max support campaign to the Iranian people. I am not talking about 170,000 U.S. troops in Iran. I'm not talking about a 2003 style invasion. I'm talking about doing everything we can to give the Iranian people the ability to finally have a government on their own, through their own measures, that represents their interests and wants to protect them rather than oppress them. So as our CEO, Mark Dubowitz, out here often says, we need the regime leaders in Tehran to be spending more time worrying about what the Iranian people might do and less time plotting to attack U.S. troops, Israel, and our Arab partners. And until we do that, we're going to have problems. And tying this to our earlier conversation, I think we're going to struggle to have sustainable peace between Palestinians and Israel as long as you have the Islamic Republic of Iran, because their grand strategy in some form since 1979 has been sow discord between Israel and Arabs to try to blur the fact that they're not Arabs and they're trying to look like they're in the cool kids club and they want it. And so we're going to struggle. We're going to struggle until we have a new government in Iran that is more focused on protecting and helping the Iranian people and less focused on exporting terrorism.
And do you want to directly respond to that? I guess you have comments and opinions on that.
Well, looking at the European position towards the previous Iran policy, Europeans and particularly Germany have been strong advocates for the JCPOA. And also, I think the fact that Iran abided by the terms long after the US pulled out. I think Europeans have been reading these as an encouragement that the JCPOA was worth all the work spent in it and that it was a good measure. I don't see that there is a change in that. As for the maximum pressure, I think the approach, especially how the sanctions were designed, was very much directed or very much affected the civil population in Iran. And therefore, I think it did not help to destabilize the regime, but rather garnered it some support. And I think, therefore, it should be thought wisely how to design sanctions to really have the maximum pressure effort that is also being felt by the regime. I think in some aspects, when we studied them, we saw also that they strengthened the regime because they created business opportunities, illegal business opportunities, by particularly the Revolutionary Guards. And that is a problem where I also say it would make sense to really look into how we want to use sanctions as a tool to really pressure Iran in the direction that you want to. But I'd also add a lot of the facts that have been achieved already in the past months, I'd say, or in the past half year in the region, the weakening of Hezbollah, for example, and a number of structures being destroyed that belong to their arsenal and their capabilities, that is an achievement already with which Iran is in a different position to negotiate. I think that is being felt by the Iranian regime. We also have a different situation in Syria because the Assad regime was a strong supporter of Iran and part of the axis of resistance, as they called themselves. With them gone, I think it is an absolute chance to open new relations with the new Syrian leadership, especially since HTS has made it very clear that they are not into meddling into their neighboring states' affairs, that they don't threaten any of them. And they have also explicitly stated that towards Israel. That is a difference to the Assad regime that opens its doors to Iranian influence. And I think that it is a good moment that these structures are gone and ousted from Syria to see what to do with that when we look at the regional security architecture that might be possible. And to add a few positive signs also, I think when Israel was attacked by Iran with drones and rockets, We've seen Jordan take a very constructive role. I think if we look into how to build on a security architecture in the region that would help Israel as guarantors beyond the fact that it is establishing itself, we should also look into how these states might be involved. We've touched upon a few states already in which I think there was a clear picture how constructive they are and how able they are to deliver. But I think we have not yet talked about Jordan, and I would say we should also look into these because fighting threats is one thing, but also building alliances. I think Jordan might be a very interesting actor and one that has an interest of its own as a neighboring state of Israel.
Do you agree?
Who's that addressed to? Sorry.
To both of you, I mean, both Brad or Avner, if you want to weigh in
no,
on Jordan's role. Do you agree that Jordan can and should play a constructive role in any kind of peace settlement?
Dr. Golab, you want to start? I would just say in 10 seconds or less, Israel and Jordan have long had a cooperative security arrangements kind of behind the scenes that has been constructive at times. But the role of the Jordanian government after October 7th in terms of its public statements has been very, very irresponsible and unhelpful. So I'd say stoking some of the radicalization that Dr. Scheller was talking about earlier. So a mixed picture, some positive security cooperation going behind the scenes, but irresponsible, unhelpful statements from the Jordanian government after October 7th too often.
I agree with Brad. I think they can play a very important and positive role. They decided to do it partially. I can understand why. They also have political constraints, but I think we are living in times of leadership. If you not have leaderships and you only complain about your political constraints, we will find ourselves in a very dire situation. We need leaders, and we need to demand our leadership to behave like leaders. And leaders do what is right and not what is, will give them another day sitting on the seat. It's absolutely true for democracy, but also for non-democratic regimes. Yes, Jordan can play a much more positive role, and they should. And when they do it, I think they can change the landscape of the Middle East, starting with the Palestinian arena, but also going all the way to Syria and to Iraq, because they are the ones to suffer from the Iranian pressure to build a new land bridge between Iran to Israel. They don't have Syria now, so they need another channel, and Jordan is in the way. And they are in the way of Turkey, of building the political Islam crescent southward from Turkey to Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. So Jordan can play, defense. But if they will start playing a positive role in the region as part of a coalition, and this is also my message to my government, Israel was educated about Zionism, that we are alone and we need to create an iron wall. I think difference is great, but from time to time we will fall. Difference is not enough. We need to be part of a regional coalition, and we have the best part, the best conditions now. Jordan should be the Saudi Arabia, UAE, United States for sure. I think Germany has a role inside, and maybe bring more European partners. I'm not sure about the EU framework, but maybe some kind of EU minilateral forums. European minilateral forums. And then we can really change the landscape of the Middle East, making sure that Iran will be weak, that Turkey will not fulfill its political Islam vision, and that Qatar will be weak, also in Israel, but also in America and in different places in Europe. You don't see people talking about it now. When, one day they will realize that we were sleeping while the Qatari worked really hard. You see it in the campuses in America. No, underneath, it's the same in Europe. And we now, I think in Israel, there is a wake-up call. So this new coalition can really change and work in favor of our joint interests. And everyone should act as a leader rather than, giving up and concede to its political constraints.
Thank you. We're really running out of time. It's the hour is already over. And maybe just one very quick last question with asking you all to give a very short answer. So I've talked about regional coalitions, and we've also mentioned the Abraham Accords. Do you think in 1 or 2 years from now, it will have been successful to have built on the Abraham Accords and extended them and extended regional cooperation, or do you think they will fall apart? Maybe start with you, Bente.
Well, it might be neither nor, because this is just a really short time frame that you're giving. So I'm not sure whether in that short time frame we will see any positive development, that they really are filled with life and that they thrive. But it doesn't mean that they necessarily fall apart. It might just mean that they need more time, particularly in this volatile situation. But I mean, we have seen things happening more quickly than we thought, like the collapse of the Syrian regime, etc. So everything is possible.
Brett?
I think a grand strategic partnership between normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, brokered by the United States, building on the Abraham Accords, would be unambiguously good for all the countries involved and for the region, and a nightmare for the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's why I think it should be a major priority. Your timeline seems a little ambitious, but I think the variables will be how much the Trump administration prioritizes this, whether the Netanyahu administration overreaches and misreads the moment, and Riyadh's perception of what's happening in Gaza. I think those will be the 3 primary variables that will determine whether we get that deal, which would be very, very good for regional peace and security.
Okay, and last sentence for you, Avner.
So, 5 years after the 73 war, we started the peace talks between Egypt and Israel. Abraham Accords withstand, I think, the greatest challenge and threat to them. I was not sure we would be able to cope with this, and we did. They survived this Gaza war. So I feel comfortable saying that within 5 years, if we have the leadership, yes, we can have much bigger coalition in the region, build upon the Abraham Accords. But again, we need the leaders.
Okay, so let's hope for the leaders. Thank you all 3 so much for taking your time. I think we have learned a lot, and you helped us understand better what's going on the ground. And let's hope that your optimistic statements towards the end will come true, even in a more extended time frame than 1 or 2 years, maybe 5 or 10 years. And we will certainly be back with other editions of Better Be Prepared on other areas. There's a lot going on right now in the world. Thank you all for joining us virtually via Zoom or on YouTube. Thank you, Bente. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Avner. And see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.